We hope you enjoy this podcast. All our conversations are inspired by films we have selected to appear on sdg.vision. So go and take a look and be inspired by people and organisations who are making valuable contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals and making our world a better place for everybody to live. Now, sit back, enjoy, be inspired, and afterwards, go and take action.
Well, welcome to the SDG Vision podcast. I'm Pierre Jones, and today really pleased to welcome Rachael Brown. Hello, Rachael.
Hi, Pierre. Thank you for inviting me and for your interest in our work.
Absolutely. We're very interested in your work on many levels, really. Just to introduce you properly, I suppose, you're senior lecturer in the School of Architecture, Art and Design at Portsmouth University. I hope I got that right.
Yep, spot on.
Great. Okay, I've been practicing that for hours. But it's lovely to have you on. The reason we got you on, or you were brought to our attention by us watching a short film. It was a presentation you made at the Dorset COP called Hope Punk in the City, and I mean that caught my attention immediately, the title of it, but it was really the content was really interesting, the ideas behind it, and that's why we reached out to you to see if we could talk and explore a little bit deeper, really, what your work is and how sustainability fits into your work, and we think the Sustainable Development Goals as well are quite present in the work that you do. Now, I mentioned the Dorset COP, and I'll be referring to COP again, and I suppose I need to perhaps explain what a COP is for those that don't know, and it's an abbreviation for Conference of the Parties. And my understanding is it's a United Nations meeting that happens every year, and there are representatives from pretty much every country in the world who come together to talk about, make decisions on climate change, and also review progress made or not made, in most cases, from decisions and commitments that were made in previous years. And the reason I say that is that you were at the Dorset COP conference. Unusual to have that was at the local level, which I think is a lovely idea. And we've actually spoken to Dorset COP as well. We think it's a great idea. And and your work that you were talking about, I believe, was inspired or it was based around the COP23, which I think was in 2017. So I really was intrigued just to know why you attended the Dorset COP, and how you see your work as relevant to the COP.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it came to my attention through my partner, Matt, who was helping with the organisation of COP23 and COP24 in Dorset. And obviously I was supporting what they were doing. So the one in 2023 was in Dorchester. And I went along and I just happened to sit next to someone who was reading this Rob Hopkins book. And I was kind of really interested in the title in particular, this concept of from what is to what if. Read it and found that it really chimed with other books I was reading. So Rebecca Solnit, who wrote Hope in the Dark, Olivia Laing, who talks about artwork in the art in an emergency. So she's written a really interesting book of essays about that. Even some little Buddhist texts I was reading as well. So it kind of really supported those other readings and underpinned. I just thought it was a real opportunity to bring it into the studio because it also chimed with what we were doing with the MA students. And I think, I'll talk a bit about how it informed the MA module and then why I returned in 2024. So the MA module so it's an interior architecture and design, and we have a lot of international students coming from quite troubled places in some circumstances. I guess we're all in a troubled place, but for them particularly challenging places. And some of the concepts in the book I found really helpful. So one of the ideas he frames is that if we can't imagine the future we want, how are we going to get there? I think, well, this is a good question. And he talks about the absence of play, particularly in early years education, but throughout education really, and how play helps to stimulate the imagination. So that for sure was helpful. And I was able to kind of ask the students to read some of the chapters. The idea from what is, so asking what if is a really helpful question in any kind of design situation. What if we think about doing it differently? What if we do it like this? And then he has this other exercise where he's done that with delegates to his talks, where he invites them to close their eyes, imagine they're stepping through a portal into the future, and then describe what it is they're seeing. So they start to imagine this future that they would like to see. And for our international students, that throws up all sorts of different responses, actually. Some of them are to do with the environment, others are to do with safety, others education. It might be to do with gender and sexuality, if they're feeling in their home country or in this country, for that matter, they feel oppressed in some way. So all sorts of issues come out. And I think it has to be done with great sensitivity and great respect for who they are and where they come from. But actually led to some really interesting conversations about the environment and activism, actually. And the other thing that's buried in the book there is this phrase, hope punk, which was coined by, what's her name? I'm going to have a look at that because I think it's important. Alexandra Rowland. So she is a fantasy author, and she was being weighed down by the news, but also the fiction being about grimdark, this kind of very negative, maybe passive, feeling overwhelmed. So she offered this alternative phrase, hope punk, which is active. So it's not naive optimism. It's saying hope, and punk, obviously coupled with that word, is a form of activism. It's a form of resistance. And it's saying to all of us, actually, we have agency and we can affect change. So again, for our students, that was an important message, that even if that change that they can affect is in the very smallest, just in the smallest way in their immediate sphere of influence, it still matters. Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, just sorry to interject, but I think punk can be seen in different ways. And I mean, I'm of a certain age where I remember punk. I was about 13, 14 when it happened. And I think one of in terms of music and art, I think, and fashion, it basically said to people, have a go. You don't need to be a trained musician to make music, and you can find different ways that may not seem musically acceptable now, but that's your expression. And is that the sort of feeling that you would like to bring into, I mean, obviously within constraints and a certain amount of discipline as well, I guess, but is that why you're attracted to the term punk?
I think it's that sense that in conditions that can make you feel overwhelmed, that you have the power to affect change, and it's that sense that you can push back, that that we should be resisting some of the things we're kind of encouraged to accept as normal, or the lack of action maybe on the part of government, that we shouldn't just be passive in the face of those things. And we did talk that, so for some of the students, that term punk is completely alien. So we did a bit of kind of unpicking of what it meant, what it was like in the original context, talked about it as a potentially positive thing, because sometimes when you look up punk, it can look quite aggressive and hostile, but we talked about it as a kind of positive movement at the time that is relevant to today's conditions. Yeah, so that was really important for the module, for the students. They responded. It was one of those really rare moments in education where everything aligned and the students were clearly enjoying it. My colleagues, Suzanne and practitioner Leslie, were also really enjoying it. So there was this alignment of energy, really, that meant that it was a really successful series of outcomes, which is why I then, to come back to your original question, why I went back to COP24, is I thought it was important for them to know some of the unintended consequences of an event like that it can have a really positive effect in ways they maybe had not anticipated, but that the reach was, it's far reaching because those students go back to their home countries across the globe, and they all wrote kind of statements about what it meant to them and how it changed their feeling about being in the world and how they might then change their approach to citizenship as well. So going beyond design, obviously that's our priority, but thinking of them as ethical citizens and activists. Yeah.
Interesting. And could you talk a little bit about what was the project?
Yeah, of course.
What were they asked to undertake?
When we did it the first year, so we're in the second year of that module now, and the first year it was for them to identify kind of forlorn and abandoned spaces in the city of Portsmouth, so around the university. So that was working in two ways, really. One, to get them to know the city, because many of them were new to the university and the town. So exploring the city, finding forlorn spaces, but that had the potential to be activated. And the brief to them was to activate spaces and communities by designing small structures, small interventions in the city, and they could determine what it was they wanted to draw people's attention to. So as I was saying earlier, I think we had quite a range of things. One group of students was really interested in the potential of mycelium and algae and how important it is for biodiversity. And so they just explored that and ended up designing a structure with those materials, actually. So also this concept of sustainable materials that aren't then going to pollute the planet, was part of the module.
So they designed it and they created it and put it in place.
So we haven't put it in place. It's always quite difficult to do that final one-to-one. But interestingly, this year we're working in Ryde with Ryde City Council, and it's possible that we could then, if one of the designs are appealing to that community, then maybe we could do a joint funding bid to get one of them built. So do have that in mind. Whether or not that will come to fruition, I don't know.
Sure.
Yeah. With the Isle of Wight context as well, it's probably important to say we've had input from Articology. I don't know if you've come across them. So there are artists and scientists working in Ryde to support the biosphere. So, and they work with clay as a material that is obviously biodegradable, to create small ecologies in the marine environment. So really, really interesting practice, actually. So they spoke to the students, they talked about the Isle of Wight biosphere. Yes, there's all sorts of external people influencing the modules as well. So practitioners, colleagues who have expertise. So this year we've had a colleague who's been talking about biomaterials and biophilic design. So this is all kind of connecting them back to the climate catastrophe, really, but thinking about sustainable practices in terms of the materials we use.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, that the importance of imagination and so the what if in your work is something that really appealed to us, because we kind of believe that to get out of the mess we're in, you have to kind of imagine where you're going, as you've said in your work. And it was interesting also, you had Rob, you referred to Rob Hopkins, who not only wrote the book, but I think he was the founder of the Transition Town movement as well. So, he's sort of, his work is actioning things as well. And it seems to me that sometimes in academia, the what if is just not there at all. It doesn't exist. And that space, which requires time to imagine, was that a brave move for you? Did it take some time? I guess you're head of your department in a way, or senior.
Yeah, I'm the module coordinator.
So you had the freedom to do that.
Yeah, and I think that is a really wonderful thing about, I guess it's similar in other institutions, but that we have that freedom to interpret, for example, the university's strategic aims. And then we have course leaders. I have been course leader at various times that map the learning journey, really, if you like, and learning outcomes, graduate attributes. But we have the freedom to interpret that, which is energizing, because otherwise you'd get quite bored and frustrated. I think you have to have that freedom. And the what if question, I think it's really important for all of us in any context, really. And with our students, we're also educating them to work with communities. Ultimately, as designers, they might be working with the end users, with people who are commissioning buildings and spaces. And one of the skills we have, I guess, is to look at a situation and say, but what if you did it like this? Or what if what you think you need isn't quite what you need? And it is a sort of brave question, I think, but it's also a way of encouraging other people to think otherwise. We all become entrenched in patterns, don't we?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think I was thinking about one of your other questions, actually, where you were saying, how do we encourage students to engage in sustainability and environmental, be active in the context of environmental problems? And I think one of the things we have to do is also model that. We say, okay, as we educate, what if we do it in a different way? And we have to sort of show bravery in that, I think, sometimes, and take risks in what we do to encourage them to do the same. And it's important they see that sometimes we're not quite sure and that we're experimenting. And that is certainly something me and my colleagues think about, how we do that.
It's really interesting because, punk was like that, in the sense that, so what if you fail? So what if you cock it up? So what if it doesn't work? We'll do it again and we'll do it differently.
Yeah.
And you learn from that. And so those echoes of the punk sort of go through. I really like that. And I think also what I really like is, what I think is important is the element of play involved in it. And, I think that, to an extent, as human beings, play is beaten out of us, really, after a certain age. And a large part of creativity is expressed through play as children, and we kind of lose that. And do you see that journey? Well, not journey, is it? Sometimes I wince at that phrase, but do you see, your students coming into your class in what is quite a formal environment, and then just opening up through not play necessarily in terms of children play, but playing around with ideas and playing around with concepts? And
I had a couple of things there, I think. One is the sadness of play being eroded, from the earlier years education. I know a lot of people who teach at different levels in education, because of the pressures of exams and meeting, stats and things like that. Stats, is that right? And you hear about music being taken out and art being reduced and dance and performance and all these things that make us rounded, happy humans have been over the years marginalised, I think. So I think that, I don't know, I haven't researched this, but it wouldn't be surprising if that was contributing to the increased levels of anxiety that we see in our students at university, that certainly have increased in the time that I've been there. And then in your answer to your question about, do they open up? Well, yes, I think there's a couple of things as design educators. So my background is in art school, interior design, and a lot of my colleagues are architecture background. We have an advantage because so much of what we do is thinking through making, thinking through drawing, which can be seen as playing with colour, playing with materials, testing an idea through model making, for example, and then trying again. And these are playful practices. It doesn't mean they're not serious. It doesn't mean we're not thinking hard. But I think one of the things we've noticed with some of our students from overseas, they actually say this to us, oh, you want to hear our opinion? We haven't really been asked for that before. There's a kind of, in other educational settings, I think they're more directed. So we do let make a space, but also maybe present some quite puzzling approaches to thinking about design, that, like the artist books, for example, that they kind of begin questioning, why is this relevant? But hopefully they understand.
Can you explain what an artist book is?
So an artist book, I think initially it started off as a way of sidestepping the galleries, the institutions, the gatekeepers. It was a kind of slightly subversive practice. I've got these are little examples. So this was from the module last year. So the artist books are ways of, they're three-dimensional, they're spatial, and they're ways of, I don't know if I can, yeah. So, hang on, I've got that upside down. So ways of this, in this case, it was documenting thinking, documenting observations, drawing.
A little bit, obviously, a bit more informal. First ideas, perhaps?
First ideas, but also experimenting. So artist books can take many forms. So there's another one here, which I actually, at the conference, the Dorset COP, I read from this because it was so moving. But this book takes on a slightly different form. So one of the things about it is it invites the reader to touch it, to hold it, to play with it. So, yeah, so it becomes something that is interactive. So I quite like her little, where is it? There's a little collage here. So she's...
Hope is an act of resistance.
Yeah, so she sort of talked about that. This student was from Iran, and she used this as an opportunity to really talk about some of her concerns about her home country. There's a beautiful...
And certainly within that context, I mean, that's very powerful, isn't it? Hope is an
very
act
powerful.
of resistance, because if you show that
yeah.
in public, particularly as a woman, perhaps,
yeah.
then that could have disastrous consequences.
And she shared that with us. So there was I think we managed to build a very trusting environment where students were able to talk about these things. And the book, just coming back to the artist book, it is in the kind of traditions of architectural drawing, the plans, sections, two-dimensional drawings are what we do. It's how we understand it. It's our kind of vocabulary, if you like. But we have to also recognise that not everybody can read those drawings. So one of the things we want to do at the MA level is challenge some of those conventions of architectural drawing so that they become more accessible. And also, the other thing about the book, sorry, it's coming to me, is that they are a way of storytelling. So the other thing that comes up in Rob Hopkins' book, and that certainly informs this module, is that the stories we tell ourselves and we tell each other are really important, because they also lead to kind of a view of the future, or we tell stories about the positive things that are happening in the world. That's important. But also as designers and practitioners, again, working with communities, working with clients, we have to bring them along. Well, they inform the story, but we have to build that story together, and we have to bring our clients along with the story of the building, for example. So the artist book as a form of storytelling is also quite important. But it's fun as well. It's fun playing with the materials and graphic composition and lettering and, visual literacy.
Do you ever experience a kickback from perhaps more traditional architects or schools of architecture that say, look, you just got no discipline. There's no discipline in this. There's no structure.
I mean, I haven't experienced that directly, but it may be that colleagues would maybe question what we're doing, and I understand that as well, that they might have more traditional or more formal ways of teaching. I think there is a place for both. I think, in practice, you need those formal skills for sure, but I think it's also good to critique them. And actually, my colleague Belinda Mitchell she's kind of writing a PhD about this. So she's the course leader. She's had quite an influence on this too.
And I was going to ask, how do you think that universities or colleges or whatever can better engage students in that process of imagination? Do you think there are ways in which institutions can? I mean, you're doing it obviously in a classroom setting, but that's just one subject. So do you think universities as a whole can better engage people in that sort of same ethos? Because you could take that ethos and apply it, I don't know, to sociology. I'm sure it is used in sociology, but in other disciplines.
Interesting. I listened to a talk a couple of weeks ago, and I wish I could remember her name. She was from Exeter University, and I think they were teaching on maybe a social science. It was something that dealt with really very potentially distressing subjects with the students, and she was talking about how they were introducing play and some of the making that in our discipline we always take for granted, but that was starting to inform how the students started to express their research, their understanding, and their ideas using things like collage, again, which is kind of a matter of course for us. But yeah, it was really interesting to hear her talk about it, because her academic positioning and her research was really clear, really clearly defined. And I found that helpful. But I think, it's a good question about the institution. So one of the things that's happening more and more, and I can only speak for Portsmouth really, as my experience, is that we're being encouraged to work more across disciplines so that we're not so siloed. And I just think that is so exciting and motivating, because for the students, the world isn't siloed in that way. For the students to be working with their peers with different skill sets and interests, and for us to be working with colleagues, say, for example, in fashion or graphic design. In illustration, we're doing that quite a lot, because artists' books come from illustrative practices. That's really fertile, and I think that will make things are kind of more vibrant and more risky in a way, but more exciting for us and the students. Does that answer your question? Or, yeah.
It does, and it leads us on very nicely, I think, to our main focus, which is the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think one of the clear issues that arise outside of the 17 different goals are that everything is interrelated.
Yeah.
That you talked about academic studies sometimes being in silos, but you can talk about that any discipline, any walk of life, really, and how that suffers from not having that wider view and looking at connections to other things, because that will better inform your understanding of what you're trying to understand. And we're really heartened to see a lot of universities actually do take the SDGs quite seriously. And try to integrate that way of thinking almost into approaching how people approach their studies or how they're taught their studies. I wonder, at Portsmouth University, have you seen that? Does that happen at all, or is that something that still needs to be worked on? Or
so the university has strategic aims, and they refer to the Sustainable Development Goals explicitly in those aims. And there are certainly some quite, how should I put it? Nationally, internationally recognised projects that are responding to the SDGs,
right,
either implicitly or explicitly. We've got the plastics revolution, but also maybe in a slightly quieter way, but still having an important effect at course level. So courses are informed by research, but some of the research is, there's funding, it attracts funding, and these become big projects. But at course and module level, the research is still important, because it still informs what we do with the students. And from what I've seen, my colleagues are amazing, because they all explore these in different ways. And again, it might be implicit or explicitly related to SDGs. But the environment, the concerns about the environment are across the board. And really interesting innovations are happening in response to that inquiry, if you like. And I was wondering, because I was thinking about that question and how it's set out at university level. So there is this kind of strategic aim, and it is delegated down to courses and modules to deliver against that, which we do because we care about it, that we're all generally very passionate about these things. But I did wonder whether we could map them more carefully across a course. So, as you say, there are all these overlapping concerns. But that might be quite an interesting exercise for us to do. We say, okay, where are we addressing these? So we do it in a more conscious way and not just rely on the individual enthusiasm. And I heard another talk actually that Zero Carbon Dorset organised, I think, with Fiona Cowney from Bournemouth University. I don't know if you've come across her. So she's doing some really interesting research where they are doing just that. They're mapping the Sustainable Development Goals at module level. And I thought that was kind of really fascinating what she's doing. Yeah, so she might be worth chatting to.
Absolutely. No, that sounds really interesting. I mean, because it is a useful framework, to refer things to.
Yeah.
And to understand cause and effect and, and how something is the result of not just one influence. It can be the result of so many different influences and those that you'd never even thought about or as possible. So, well, that's encouraging to hear that Portsmouth is using the SDGs. But as you say, there's work to be done, perhaps, and to enrich the studies that student studies and also research that's being undertaken.
But as I say, there's plenty of evidence of good work being done. And something you said just reminded me of another text we've been referring to, is titled Ideas, Arrangements and Effects. And it is focused on design, but actually it's a really good tool for thinking about societal ideas and arrangements that we just take for granted. Capitalism is an idea, it's an arrangement and it has an effect. And for the students to use that as a tool to examine, it could just be a space as big as a room that we think about it, but it could also be a way of understanding the urban environment, or when we're looking at a big building, what are these established ideas that we might think, well, what if that idea changed? What would the effect be? So these are quite useful words, I think, as well.
And it's also, I guess, within architecture and design as well, that things have consequences. And thinking about, if we just slap this building up here and don't take into regard the effect it has upon the ecology or existing people's living arrangements or experiences, then that will have negative consequences. I imagine architecture wasn't always this broad thinking. I mean, I imagine, when would you date this sort of thinking back to? 60s or 1960s? Or?
Yeah, I mean, this sort of feminism, I think, had quite an impact on that.
Right.
Some of the feminist practices. Well, that it led people to think differently about, I guess it was the kind of even urban planning. There's a really good book. What's it called? I can't remember. But she talks about the urban environment, how originally it was designed maybe for men who were commuting in cars or on trains, but that led to a radial urban plan towards the centre, neglecting the needs of, at the time, it would have been women who were caring for children, who needed to go not radially, but in concentric patterns to reach local nursery schools, for example. So it's sort of thinking about the needs of everyone. And I think another example is, I lost my thread a bit there. Yeah, the feminist practices that started to think about the kind of diversity and inclusion. So not just making things accessible, make them inclusive. And a lot of that came out of working directly with the end users. So often people commission the building aren't the end users. And so that was a big change, I think, when understanding the needs of users were foregrounded, because they're the ones who are going to spend time in buildings. When we craft, so as I say, my expertise is in the interior. When we're crafting an interior, it has a profound effect on people's lives, because most of our lives are spent inside buildings. And when we think about that, then it makes us, we talk to the students about this, that we must take care of the needs of those users. And that has led to, that kind of thinking has also led to changes, for example, in hospitals, where nurses' stations were always buried in the building. There was no access to light. That's really bad for you, for mental health, physical health. And that led to a change in how hospitals were designed. So,
But that's interesting, isn't it? Because if the nurses aren't happy, then the patients are going to cop it, really.
and that's just thinking otherwise, isn't it? But also thinking in this partnering with communities is really important, that we don't just impose a solution on people.
Oh, and would you say that's mainstream thinking now?
I think so, yeah. I mean, yeah, there might be, I guess one of my criticisms of some architecture is that maybe it's designed as an object in space. So it might be considering the urban environment and how it relates to that, but not designed from the inside out. And I think maybe that has changed for sure. My first job was at Hampshire County Architects, and they were an example of really good caring architecture, where you're designing schools and colleges and public buildings. There's many, many, many really good examples of that care being enacted through design.
It's interesting. And it sort of, I was struck in your talk on the film at the Dorset COP about mindfulness and the role of mindfulness. I know that mindfulness now has almost been commodified in certain respects, but there is, I think it has real value. Could you? I mean, I think you've touched upon it already, but is there anything about mindfulness that you'd like to enlarge upon, perhaps in terms of your own discipline, but also, I suppose, your own life and your philosophy?
Yeah, and I think some of this it doesn't necessarily come from Thich Nhat Hanh. I'm not a Buddhist, and I can't claim to have read many books.
Yeah.
But some of what is written articulates my position really clearly, I think, and it's about how once we see a problem, we can't pretend it's not there. So you have to, if the environment is troubled, we can't turn a blind eye to that. We must say, okay, I've seen that. So what do I do about it? My personal actions matter, even if it's small changes in my behaviour. I believe, I want to try and be as ethical as I can be, and that isn't always easy. We have to make decisions. Clothes shopping, and sometimes I think, I've just bought this thing without being mindful. And I think if you can practice mindfulness, it just slows you down and it makes you think more carefully. I think care is a really important word. As individuals, that we take care of the environment around us, the ecologies around us, the people around us, the places around us. It takes quite a lot of energy, but it's important to think,
It is, and I mean, we can lead our lives. I mean, we all do. I mean, even those of us that think we are acting mindfully, it's only in certain parts of our day that we are. And I was really interested when you said, well, if you see that nature is or the ecology, local ecology is being affected, but you've got to be able to see it in the first place, haven't you? And to be aware, because I think a lot of people aren't aware. Not their fault necessarily,
because we're all overwhelmed by other types of stories that tell us that everything's fine, consume this, eat that, that fly here, have another holiday. We're all overwhelmed by that kind of advertising and manipulation. And I'm subject to that too. But it's to being aware of that, and I don't judge anyone who maybe doesn't see it in the way I see it. We're kind of almost encouraged to not think. I've got this, I was just looking in front of me actually, because one of the things I read, I could read it to you. It's just, it says, wake up to the beauties of the planet and wake up to the suffering of the world and understand that humans are not separate. So that sense that we're not somehow separate from all the other ecologies around us. And if we can do that, then we begin to act in ways that change the world little by little. And I think if you can believe that those small acts, that we have agency, and that's what we try and encourage the students to believe, because I believe they do. I'm not trying to kind of, it could be seen as almost fatuous, you know, for students coming from Moran and you say, I'll have hope that you have agency. Even in that situation, you do in the smallest, even if it's in the smallest way.
It's interesting, and I think really interesting in terms of what you're talking about, dominant narratives, and I think it just speaks a lot to your work in the sense that this sort of hope punk is look at things differently. We can change the narrative. It goes back to Rob Hopkins' book, about you know, looking at things differently, and the what if. You know, and I think that that's all really important. And I think that, you know, you say that people, it's not their fault that they don't see, but of course, everything, pretty much the dominant narratives around us are there to sell products, and often it's easier to do the things that because that's the way society has been created.
And that's the idea, isn't it? When you come back to ideas, arrangements and effects, this is an idea which is about consumerism, isn't it?
Yes. Absolutely. I'd like to talk about your work, your sort of what your illustration work, because I've seen it and I thought it was terrific, and I think it embodies a lot of what you're saying. And I'd like to explore it a little bit more. I know that you have a master's in illustration, and you know you have on your website. We'll put it in a link below. One of the your illustrations or set of illustrations that I found really interesting. I spent most time looking at. It was called Time After Time, I think. Could you perhaps and we'll put some images of that on the screen because it's really worth sharing. Can you talk about what that series of illustrations is about? And I don't know why, but when I looked at it, for some reason, sort of Aboriginal dreaming. You know, that sort of dream time or the dreaming sort of flashed into my mind. I don't know whether that's relevant or not.
It is relevant. There are a number of references. I'll come back to that. So let's, going back to 2016, 2015, the refugee crisis was really building ahead of steam, really. And I don't know if you remember the image.
In Europe.
In Europe, yeah, absolutely. And the image of Alan Kurdi, who's the little boy, I mean, it was heartbreaking, but his body was on the front of all the newspapers. And at the time, I was campaigning to remain as a Remainer. I was also campaigning against anti-austerity and going on all sorts of demonstrations and marches and environmental campaigns. And to be honest, I was feeling quite desperate. I was feeling overwhelmed. And I started doing some illustrations, and one of them was of the baobab trees. And some of them are like 5,000 years old, and they'd started to collapse. And again, this was just adding to my feelings of anxiety. And Olivia Lang talks about it's like you're in a tumble dryer and you can't pause, you can't press the pause button. And another news story comes and another news story, and it's just really exhausting. Anyway, I did an illustration of the baobab tree and went back to the Little Prince book. And in the Little Prince book, there's a phrase that says, I think it's something like, I drew the trees with a sense of urgency. And when I read that, I thought, oh, this is what I'm doing. I'm drawing and painting with a sense of urgency. And it also is a sense of catharsis, I think, where I thought, okay, let's take time to, if we're in a tumble dryer and I need to pause, well, let's pause through the making. Let's use the making to slow time down, to give the things that happened their due. It's almost like an act of respect. You know, the Grenfell fire. I want to take time to just think about those people. I don't want it to be forgotten.
So can we just go back to this, your reference to Grenfell, which was the Grenfell Tower block in pretty much the centre of very central London, really. It was inhabited, multiple occupation, big tower block, that there was a fire. And, you know, that wouldn't have happened in a building where more affluent people would have lived. And it was incredibly avoidable. It was about saving costs, etc., etc. And that features in one of your parts of the time after time series. So, but that's not the only thing that appears in that. There are other images. So could you explain how they relate to each other? And,
Yeah. So the first of a series of three. So what you've seen is 4 plates, and that's the first panorama. So it was, as I say, documenting the period between 2016 and 2021. And it begins with me looking back out of the picture plane, back towards 2015, if you like. And then as you move across that picture plane, it's picking up, among other things, the Brexit vote, Trump coming to power, Make America Great Again, the refugee crisis, the Jubilee, this idea of water and what it symbolises. And then Jo Cox,
she was a Labour MP.
Labour MP, who was campaigning for Remain. Yeah, very inspiring person. Her famous for the phrase, "There is something like there's more that unites than divides us." I think that's such an important thing to carry. All of us should carry that thought. Yeah, and then I'm just thinking, remembering the painting. So into Grenfell Tower, and then the ice Larsen Sea carving away.
Oh, was it iceberg?
Huge iceberg carving away, yeah. Anyway, so this was the kind of, these are the things, and there are many more things, but these are the things that were weighing me down, if you like, and also feeling a bit desperate about, but wanting to take time to think about. But what I also recognised, with Hope Punk in mind, is that there were positive news stories that were happening at the same time that we just didn't get to hear about. So actually what I did at the beginning of 2016 is subscribed to a magazine called Positive News. And then that sort of told me there were other stories that we could tell each other, that wasn't, not to diminish these real things that were happening, but to say, okay, there is hope here. The kind of panda, the tiger species of numbers are recovering. The river, Wanganui River in New Zealand, has been conferred the same rights as a human to protect its ecologies. Malala was made UN ambassador. All these really good news stories as well, and individual people doing good things. I can't remember his name, but there was a footballer who became known as the Grenfell Gardener. Yeah, I can't remember his name now, but so it's this, and the panoramic form it takes is so that you're not looking into the picture plane, you're looking across it, that leads into the next panorama. And as you pointed out, so I lived in Australia for a year and read books about the dreamings and studied the artwork. And for sure, that's an influence in what I do. But also Chinese scrolls and the Indian. I went to an exhibition called Garden and Cosmos, 10 years ago now, which are the Indian miniatures, and how they tell a narrative through this very detailed illustrative method. Yeah. So I don't know if that answered your question.
No, certainly. I mean, it certainly does. And I think it really relates to a lot of what we've been talking about as well, that, within a year, there are all these issues that are on the same planet. They're happening on the same planet. And they may not be directly influencing each other. Sorry, you were going to say something.
Yeah, it just reminded me that it's about that connected ecologies, that we're all intertwined, but it's also one of the main themes actually that I'm missing is this idea of time and scale. So our scale, different scales of existence. So the cosmic scale and the microscopic scale, and also that some of the imagery goes back to kind of fossils and dinosaurs.
That sort of temporal element, yeah.
I just, on my wall, just to the side of me, is the sketching out of the next 2 panoramas that I haven't got to yet. But
oh, good. Are you going to do more?
I've got 2 more. So that was the one you've seen is just 2016, 2017. So then I've got 18, 19 and 2021 to go.
Well, terrific. I mean, we'd love to have you back just to look at those and talk through those.
It might take me about 4 years, I think.
But, I think it's really interesting, everything you said today. When you mentioned the tumble dryer, it really resonated with me, because I think more so than ever now, it feels that things are issues and political and military and ecologically are just whizzing around and tumbling on your head. And I think, as you say, the ability for art to allow us to breathe, or it is really important. I think, and also within the discipline of architecture, as well as art within your illustrations, I think that plays a really important role. And I think the hope punk thing, I think that, to an extent, that's what punk did. People were so pent up and angry at the social economic malaise at the time that music allowed them to express their anger, and through that it became a positive thing, and through that, goodness knows what other musical forms evolved, through that process. So I think the work you're doing is really important.
Oh, thank you.
We're just really, really pleased to have you on and talk about all these connected and interconnected issues. And we'd love to have you back on to talk when you do finish.
I'll let you know. It'll be a big moment when I finish them. Can I just say something else as well because you touched on it. And one of the things I read about it, what we have to do as academics is situate our work for research and underpin it with theory and what other people have written. One of the things I read that was really helpful was about autoethnography. So how my point of view, my position, can maybe inform. I'm going to rewind that a bit. So it talks about the I, you, and we. So the I is my point of view, my perspective, what I've noticed, that maybe represents a collective experience, that the we, but might also resonate with you, the reader, on an individual level. And I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about what some art does, what the purpose of art is. And it is to create that room for I, you, and we to have a place to meet, in a way, and a place to remember.
And understand different perspectives. And there's a certain gentleman who appears in one of your time after time shots. He's a sort of a blimp figure, an orange ball floating, being propelled by his own steam. and if only he could listen. A certain gentleman in the White House at the moment, who's president of the United States, if only he could listen to the importance of perspective and listening to and noticing and understanding different perspectives.
Yeah, he has no interest in doing so, sadly. But
he doesn't. But, hey, the rest of us do. And the work that you do, really does add to the positive force, and makes it possible a new future and a different way of being more possible. So I want to thank you very much and encourage you to carry on, Rachael. Lovely. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for your kind words. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Smashing. We look forward to it. Thank you, Rachael. Bye-bye now.
Now, if you enjoyed that, go and have a look at their film and many, many others on sdg.vision.